Hi, I'm J.M. Frey, and welcome back to the Skylark song. It's time for chapter 12. And if you'll notice, we're about halfway through the book. About an hour after sunset, judging by the quality of the light outside, the door opened again. The seneschal was back, and this time he waited at the threshold expectantly. Robin stood and limped to the door. If he saw her brown boots under the tangling swish of her skirts, he didn't mention them. The seneschal offered his arm, and though she had absolutely no desire to take it, she needed the support to walk. They traveled in silence, and Robin kept her eyes open and her mind sharp. She catalogued each arrogant-looking Klonn in their ice-blue uniforms as they filled out the frame of each portrait hung along the wall. She studied each ridiculously fussy vase on a pedestal. She counted each doorway and hall, each overwhelming spray of flowers in the corners, trying to find a way to remember. She even counted the stuffed dogs. They were enshrined under glass bells with plaques declaring them the loyal companion of this dead duke or another. Even in death, they had not escaped the eyes of their masters. Robin felt sympathy for them, watched and prized and never able to get away. Would she, too, one day be stuffed and mounted behind glass? Would her plaque read, Robin Arianhod, war prize of the Klonn. She was docile and obedient. Eventually. The seneschal picked one of the many heavy, dark wooden doors that dappled the corridor and opened it with a key that looked exactly like all the rest on the ring that hung from his belt. Robin couldn't decipher anything unique about the key or this door that would help her to ensure she stole the right one later. She'd just have to take the entire ring. The room they entered was huge, easily the size of the officers' mess back on base. Every lamp was turned all the way up, and a great glittering glass chandelier sparkled from the vaulted ceiling. The warmth of the flames behind their glass made the room cozy, even for all its great size, and Robin shuddered at the way her perceptions had been so twisted without her permission. The Klonn were not supposed to be anything but terrible and sterile. Cozy was not supposed to be within their parameters. The walls were adorned with a thick blue paper covered in elaborate geometric designs and spackled by portraits of important-looking men and women, the latter painted with elaborate hairstyles and dresses that pushed their breasts up obscenely. They were all draped in a revolting amount of jewelry and medals, no matter their age or gender, and it made Robin sick to think how much she could fetch for just one of the rings that dappled those painted fingers, how much good that money would have made back home. She wished that the portraits contained the real thing, so she could snatch the knickknacks and stuff them into her pockets. 2 place settings had been made up at the far end of the massively, ornately carved table. They were shrouded behind a large potted plant sat right in the middle of the table like an overgrown centerpiece, which gave the 2 chairs the illusion of intimacy. Robin swallowed hard and detached herself from the seneschal. She lifted her chin and limped proudly to the seat, to the left of the large carved chair placed at the head of the table. Lupine motifs loped across the arms and around the back. It was clear for whom that chair was meant. A sharp panic welled in the hollow of her throat, and she reminded herself that her fear of the man was all superstitious drivel. He was not a hobgob or a specter, and she could damn well sit beside him and eat. She'd already traded barbs with him. She could do this. The Coyote wasn't there yet, and she decided not to wait for him. She certainly didn't owe him the honor. Instead, she plopped into the chair the seneschal pulled out for her with as much deliberate, sullen resentment as she could summon. There was bread in a basket, and a butter dish within reach, and water trembled in a finely cut glass that perspired gently in the heat of the room. A massive hearth, set into the wall behind her and big enough to make her guess that wherever she was, it was old, crackled with a fire as well. Robin had to pretend that she didn't hear its sound, pretend it didn't remind her of the orange light that had filled the cabin of the glider as she and Al had plummeted towards the forest floor. Her shoulders still curled up around her ears all the same. Under the silver dome covering her plate, Robin found a gently steaming, artfully arranged display of vegetables, rice, and meat cut so finely and cooked so little that it shook like a leaf in her hand when she lifted her fork to inspect it. It was practically still bloody. Gross. She'd heard that the Klonn sometimes ate their meat practically raw, but she had dismissed it as the folly of the Saskwyan people trying to demonize their enemy. To see the truth of those rumors before her disturbed Robin more than she cared to admit. If this rumor had been proven to be true, then what others might be as well. The stories told in the pilot's lounge crowded against her imagination with more insistence, and she shoved them back with a vicious refusal to linger. She hesitated with a gob of rice on her fork, and then decided it was all or nothing. Either they would poison her, or they wouldn't. Either way, she wouldn't be at her best if she starved herself. If she was going to heal enough, if she was going to be granted the food and drink she would need to regain her strength, then she would have to consume this. Though she may have to play act complacency in order to continue to get meals. It was a revolting thought, but there was no other option for now, not that she could see. Trust me, the Coyote had begged, and for a second, fear flashed through his eyes. But fear for which one of them, exactly? And fear of whom? Robin shoved that thought aside and tucked in. She didn't bother to look up when she heard the door to the room open and close, and the booted footsteps approach. A bottle of wine was set down on the table between the two place settings, and the Coyote dropped into his chair. Robin looked up, and then froze, startled. He wasn't wearing his mask. Her first thought was, Gods, he's young. Up close, face bare, he was sort of attractive, though Robin despised having to admit that to herself. Not traditionally attractive, not the way that Wade was devastatingly good-looking or her father was solid and objectively handsome. The Coyote's nose was just a hair too narrow, his eyes too washed out to properly be called gray, and his complexion was pale and sickly to the point of being practically blue. He would have looked ephemeral, like a charcoal sketch that had been rubbed too often and was fading to nothingness, if it wasn't for the black anchor of his hair. A scruffy, half-assed goatee obscured his chin, younger than Wade then, but certainly older than Al. No more than 20 at the most, Robin thought. Her second thought was, Gods, he looks weary. A surge of guilt and loathing flooded her thoughts, and she stopped her perusal. It was an insult to Al's memory to even study the face of the man who had killed him so openly. The food sank like a cold stone in Robin's gut, and she set down her fork and pushed her plate away, no longer hungry. I see that you were too famished to wait, the Coyote said conversationally in his Bene-perfect Saskwyan, unaware of the irony of that proclamation. He propped his chin on a hand and watched her with slitted eyes. He was wearing another of those fancy Klonn jackets, all shining black fabric and that tall, wide band of collar that the Klonn always seemed to prefer, with embroidered edgings. You look like a proper lady, he said, reaching out and brushing one bare knuckle across the side of her neck. He hesitated for just a moment when Robin recoiled, then settled his bare palm on her naked forearm instead, a parody of comfort. Robin's skin prickled with the realization that, outside of his clinical inspection of her palms, this was the first time they'd touched flesh to flesh. We will have to find a better cut of dress for you, though such arms, and the noble palate does not suit your skin tone, which is inconvenient, he said with a sniff. And then he reached out and pinched a lock of hair that had escaped its ribbon, rolling it between his thumb and middle finger. Don't, Robin said, and jerked back. He let the hair fall rather than tugging at it. How remarkable, the Coyote said. I have read of such instances of hair suddenly losing all color after a trauma. It was quite a colorful crash, and you have been asleep for over a day. I suppose a transformation such as this would take time. Your hair was still brown in the forest. Robin looked down, shamed. His keen, assessing gaze, so frank, so intent, made her uncomfortable. It is fitting, I think, the Coyote whispered. Yes, your people call albinos the nowhere folk, if I'm not mistaken. How poetical. And in this case, apt. Robin stared hard at her lap and concentrated on saying nothing. Each word was like a slap to the face, and she refused to let him see her flinch. A task made worse by the fact that he seemed not to understand just how insulting it all was. A Seelie would never be a nowhere person unless they were utterly without a hive of bees to direct them home. Nowhere people belonged to a world without boundaries. The ghost-haired were not from nowhere. They were from everywhere. Robin was far from her mother's hives now, and it was possible she would now never have any of her own either, but she was not without a home to return to. All she need given was an opportunity to do so. Through with his inspection of her, for the time being at least, the Coyote removed the dome from his own plate and began to eat. The wobbly, undercooked meat slipped around his mouth, and Robin swallowed against the sour urge to be ill. She raised her hands to thank the gods for what little of the meal she'd eaten. They still deserved their due, whether she had enjoyed the meal or not, and she still believed in them, even if they had abandoned her to the nowhere folk, either for plot or for purpose. She needed to believe in them, needed the anchor, the familiarity, the comfort of the ritual. But before she could close her eyes, the Coyote grabbed hold of her closest wrist, tugging her hand back down to the tabletop. A quick flash of fear was back in his eyes. They flicked to the door once, subtly, and Robin's heart stuttered to realize that the seneschal was still there, glowering at her through the fronds of the plant. "None of that now," he admonished, voice pitched low and soft. "You are in Klonn now, my dear, and you will comport yourself accordingly. Do not give our hosts any more reason to despise you." "Please." Robin met his gaze, held it for a moment, trying to decide if the cold civility she saw reflected in the gray of his eyes was anything other than what it seemed. Finally, she nodded once, and the Coyote released her wrist, pointedly returning to his dinner. Dismissed out of hand. Insulting. Robin swallowed hard and lowered her hands to her lap. She kept them palm up, though, and finished her prayers in her head, daring the Coyote to read her mind and stop her. Instead, the Coyote poured them each a glass of wine. He set hers down in front of her and reached for his own. As he picked it up off the table, his eyes flickered towards the door, narrowing for a fraction of a heartbeat on the place where the seneschal still stood, perched like a gargoyle overseeing their meal. Then he turned to her and offered her a smile that was tight around the edges. "To the 7 arts," the Coyote said in salute, and when Robin didn't raise her glass to the toast, he huffed and tapped the edge of his wine glass against hers, where it stood still on the table. Robin tilted her head, eyeing him shrewdly. What was wrong with him? Why did he behave as if he was afraid? When she still didn't move to pick up her glass, he nodded towards it, eyebrows lifted. Robin waited for him to sip his first, just to be sure, before she finally grabbed her glass and took a sullen mouthful of her own. It was laced with honey. The unexpected familiarity, the taste of home, made tears spring up into her eyes. She blinked them back furiously, determined not to show even the smallest speck of emotion in front of him. It was a losing battle. She set down her glass and covered her face with her hands so the Coyote couldn't see, but it was too late. Oh no, please do not cry," the Coyote said, seeming to be genuinely distressed. One of his spidery hands landed on her shoulder, a mimicry of a concerned lover's caress. "I thought it would be a nice gift for you. You must not cry." Robin pulled her hands down to glare at the Coyote with raw eyes. I'm not crying." He sent another furtive gaze darting at the seneschal again, and Robin was beginning to see why he kept his helmet on so much. Much as he tried to hide it behind his officious pronouncements and grand gestures, he actually seemed worried about her. There was a kernel hidden deep under this performance of true concern, true fear, of genuineness that the helmet would have hidden. But why? "I keep them," he'd said about the other mid-flights. But there was no indication that they were still here, that they, too, were being insulted by ridiculous, overbearing clothing or what was probably supposed to be a fancy meal. They weren't here. being offered honeyed wine and touches that were probably meant to be comforting, but that just made her more and more uncomfortable. "That is another habit we must break you of," the Coyote whispered, hiding his mouth behind his wineglass as though he feared someone might be reading his lips. It didn't make sense. He was the Coyote, the scourge of the skies. He was ruthless, dishonorable, brutal, not fearful, kind, and concerned. Something wasn't adding up. "What habit?" she asked. "Contractions. No one in Klonn is so low-bred enough to utilize contractions. You must say, 'I am.'" "I won't," Robin hissed back, defiant and just about sick to the teeth of being told what she could and couldn't do. The Coyote slammed his knife point down into the table, and when he let it go, it remained there, embedded, the handle shivering. "Will not," he corrected evenly, but there was something in the action, something in the horrible, sudden, tight blankness in his eyes that... He's play-acting, she realized. He's pretending to be overbearing and cruel. Why? Why the show? Why any of it? The puzzle itched at her brain in places she couldn't reach, teasing and just beyond her grasp. Instead, Robin stared at the wine and bit her lip hard enough to keep all of the horrible cusses she wanted to spit at him contained. It would do absolutely no good to ask these questions and to get him angry. She had to hold on to her rage, keep it close, keep it secret within her, let it keep her powerful. The Coyote removed the knife. She remained quiet as he finished eating, and then he haughtily rang a little bell that had been sitting unseen by Robin beside his chair. The seneschal came and cleared their dishes. Robin wondered if there were any other servants in the building. It would make her escape all the easier if there was only the one. On the other hand, there could be hundreds, and perhaps Robin was only seeing him. She gritted her teeth against the frustration. Gosh, she hated not knowing where her horizons lay. The seneschal returned with 2 small dishes of a rich, moist cake, and Robin's defiant willpower crumbled enough that she ate this alongside the Coyote in small, hesitant bites. It wasn't healthy, but it was fuel, and that was all that mattered just now. And yes, okay, it was goddamn delicious. When both their plates were empty, the Coyote sat back, running his finger along the rim of his wineglass, making it hum a clear, perfect note. Robin raised her eyes at the sound and saw, for the first time, that there was a dark black bruise on the side of the Coyote's face. The one that was furthest from her, the one he'd hidden with his hands whenever he turned to her, making it look like boredom or exhaustion. She studied his posture and realized that he was slumped, shoulders curled inwards around some sort of hurt that she couldn't see. Surprised at the surge of pity that filled her, she asked, "What happened to you?" His finger paused on the rim of the glass, silencing that Skylark sound, and he huffed, as if answering was beneath him. And then he answered all the same. "I was punished for leaving behind the body of your mid-flight." Robin's heart quavered. He described his punishment so matter-of-factly, she had to wonder how often it had happened before. "Why would your general beat his best pilot? That doesn't make any sense." Then, suddenly, it dawned on Robin. Everything the Coyote had said in the forest, every whisper in her ear, even the way he spoke, made it screamingly obvious, and Robin wondered why she'd ever missed the clues. Robin ducked as far behind the plant as she was able and raised her own wineglass to hide her mouth in turn, the same way he had. "You're the other prisoner," she said. The Coyote grinned, his smile filled with self-loathing and defeat. "There now. How clever you are," he said, and leaned out to chime the bowl of his wineglass against hers in a bitter salute. "I knew you would come to the truth eventually."